"You're fired!" screamed Victoria, the VP's daughter, during the biggest deal of my career. $5 billion hung in the balance as investor Harrison Blake froze mid-signature. "Who?" he asked, confused. Her Victoria smirked, pointing at me. Blake just laughed, slid the term sheet to Victoria's father, and tapped a specific line. "The key person clause," he said calmly. Victoria's face went white. That moment changed everything. But let me back up to how I got there. My name is Sandy, and 3 years ago I thought I had landed my dream job at Meridian Tech Solutions in Austin, Texas. The company specialized in AI security software, and I was brought on as a senior business development specialist, straight out of Stanford with a computer science degree and big ambitions. The downtown Austin office buzzed with energy, housed in a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the Texas sunrise perfectly each morning. Robert Hartman, the CEO and founder, had personally recruited me during my final semester. He was a silver-haired man in his early 60s, the kind of leader who remembered everyone's birthday and genuinely cared about building something meaningful. During my interview, he spoke passionately about transforming cybersecurity through artificial intelligence, and his vision aligned perfectly with everything I had studied and dreamed about. My daily routine became a comfortable rhythm. I lived in a cozy one-bedroom apartment just 15 minutes from downtown with a small balcony that overlooked Lady Bird Lake. Every morning, I would grab coffee from the local shop downstairs and arrive at the office by 7:30, usually the first person there besides the security guard. I loved those quiet morning hours when I could review client files and prepare for the day without distractions. The work itself was exhilarating. I spent my days developing relationships with potential clients, understanding their security challenges, and crafting customized solutions using our AI technology. But my biggest breakthrough came just 6 months into the job when I identified Blake Industries as a potential client. Harrison Blake had built a manufacturing empire worth billions, but their cybersecurity was outdated and vulnerable. I spent weeks researching their infrastructure, understanding their pain points, and developing a presentation that would speak directly to their needs. The initial meeting took place in Blake's corporate headquarters, a gleaming 40-story tower in downtown Dallas. Harrison Blake himself attended, which surprised everyone since CEOs rarely involved themselves in vendor meetings. He was younger than I expected, probably in his mid-40s, with sharp blue eyes and an intensity that made you want to impress him. When I presented our AI security framework showing how it could predict and prevent cyber attacks before they happened, something clicked. What started as a $50,000 pilot project grew into something extraordinary. Our AI system successfully prevented 3 major cyber attacks in the first month, saving Blake Industries millions in potential damages and downtime. Harrison was so impressed that he expanded our contract to cover all his manufacturing facilities across 12 states. Within 18 months, Blake Industries had become our largest client, accounting for nearly 40% of our revenue. The relationship became deeply personal for me. I worked directly with Blake's IT team, understanding their challenges and continuously improving our solutions. I spent countless evenings and weekends refining the algorithms, ensuring our software evolved with emerging threats. Harrison began calling me directly when issues arose, bypassing normal corporate channels, because he trusted my judgment and technical expertise. Robert noticed my dedication and results. During my second-year review, he pulled me aside and promised that partnership opportunities were coming. He spoke about expanding my role, giving me equity in the company, and positioning me as a key leader in our growth strategy. I felt valued, appreciated, and excited about my future at Meridian Tech. My personal life was flourishing too. I had started dating Jake, a nurse at Austin Methodist Hospital, who I met at a coffee shop near my apartment. He was kind, supportive, and genuinely interested in my work, even though technology wasn't his field. We would spend weekends hiking the trails around Austin or exploring the local music scene, and he helped me maintain balance between my career ambitions and personal happiness. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in March when Robert called an all-hands meeting. The entire company gathered in our main conference room, about 60 employees, ranging from developers to sales staff to administrative support. Robert stood at the front looking both excited and nervous and announced that he was beginning to plan his retirement. At 63, he wanted to spend more time with his grandchildren and pursue some personal interests he had put aside while building the company. But then came the announcement that shifted my entire world. Robert introduced his daughter Victoria as the new vice president of business development, a position that would put her directly above me in the company hierarchy. Victoria strode to the front of the room with confidence that seemed unearned, a 26-year-old woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expensive business suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She began speaking about her vision for the company using buzzwords like synergy and optimization, without demonstrating any real understanding of our technology or client relationships. She mentioned her MBA from Wharton and her experience in consulting, but when someone asked about specific cybersecurity knowledge, her answers were vague and generic. I felt a knot forming in my stomach as I realized this person with no apparent technical background or client relationship experience was now my supervisor. Over the following days, Victoria began inserting herself into my client relationships, particularly with Blake Industries. She scheduled herself into my regular check-in calls, introduced herself as the primary point of contact for strategic decisions, and started positioning me as the technical support person rather than the relationship manager. When I tried to explain the history and nuances of the Blake relationship, she dismissed my concerns with a wave of her hand. The breaking point came during a client dinner at Austin's most expensive steakhouse, a place where I had never eaten before because it was far beyond my budget. Victoria had arranged the dinner to celebrate the renewal of Blake Industries' annual contract, inviting Harrison Blake, his chief technology officer, and several other executives. I assumed I would be presenting our upcoming innovations and discussing expansion opportunities as I had done many times before. Instead, Victoria dominated the entire conversation. She sat at the head of the table, ordered the most expensive wine without consulting anyone, and began talking about the AI security framework as if she had developed it herself. She described the technical innovations, the implementation strategy, and the results we had achieved, completely erasing my role in the process. When Harrison asked about specific technical details, Victoria smoothly deflected by saying she preferred to focus on strategic vision rather than operational minutiae. The moment that shattered my professional confidence came when Victoria raised her glass for a toast. She thanked Harrison for his continued partnership and expressed her excitement about taking their relationship to the next level. Then she looked directly at Harrison and said, "I developed this AI security framework specifically with Blake Industries in mind, and I see tremendous opportunities for expansion. Sandy here has been wonderful with implementation support, but now that I'm leading business development, you'll be working directly with me on all strategic initiatives." I sat there in stunned silence, watching 3 years of my work creativity and relationship building being claimed by someone who couldn't explain the difference between machine learning and artificial intelligence. Harrison looked confused and slightly uncomfortable, glancing between Victoria and me as if sensing something wasn't right. But Victoria's confidence was so overwhelming, her presentation so polished, that doubt began creeping into my mind. Maybe I had been naive to think my technical work and client relationships would protect my position. maybe this was just how corporate politics worked, and I needed to accept my new reality as support staff rather than a strategic leader. The drive home that night was a blur of confusion and hurt. Jake was waiting for me at my apartment with takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant, but I could barely eat. When I explained what had happened, his normally calm demeanor shifted to quiet anger. He reminded me of all the late nights I had worked, all the innovative solutions I had created, all the times Harrison Blake had specifically requested my input on critical decisions. But his support, while comforting, couldn't erase the sick feeling in my stomach that my career was being systematically dismantled by someone who saw me as an obstacle to her advancement. The weeks following that dinner became a masterclass in workplace sabotage, though it took me time to recognize the systematic nature of Victoria's campaign. At first, I attributed the changes to normal growing pains as she settled into her new role. I tried to be generous, thinking maybe she was nervous about proving herself and would eventually recognize the value of collaboration. I couldn't have been more wrong. Victoria began by reassigning my team members to different projects without consulting me. My 2 junior analysts, fresh graduates who I had been mentoring for months, were suddenly working on market research for potential new clients rather than supporting our existing Blake Industries relationship. When I asked Victoria about the changes, she smiled sweetly and explained that she wanted to optimize our human resources for maximum strategic impact. The corporate jargon flowed effortlessly, but the message was clear: my role was being systematically diminished. The exclusion from meetings started subtly. Victoria would schedule strategy sessions during times when I was on client calls or attending industry conferences. When I missed these meetings, she would express concern about my commitment and engagement. She created a new weekly leadership meeting for senior staff, but somehow forgot to include me despite my seniority and client relationships. When I mentioned the oversight, she apologized profusely and promised to add me to future meetings, but the invitations never came. My access to information began disappearing too. Client files that had always been available through our shared system suddenly required special permissions that Victoria controlled. Financial reports about our Blake Industries revenue information I needed to understand our performance and plan future strategies became classified as executive-level materials. When I requested access, Victoria explained that she was implementing new security protocols to protect sensitive information, as if I hadn't been handling these exact materials for 3 years. The rumors started circulating through the office grapevine with surgical precision. Colleagues began mentioning conversations where Victoria had expressed concerns about my attitude and adaptability. According to these secondhand reports, I was struggling with the transition to new leadership and demonstrating resistance to innovative approaches. Some coworkers started treating me differently with a mixture of sympathy and distance that made me feel like a wounded animal everyone wanted to avoid. My attempts to address these issues professionally led me to Martha Collins, our Human Resources Director. Martha was a kind woman in her 50s who had always been approachable and fair in her dealings with staff concerns. I scheduled a confidential meeting and carefully explained the situation, focusing on specific examples rather than emotional reactions. I showed her documentation of my work on the Blake Industries account email chains, demonstrating my role in developing client relationships and evidence of my contributions to company revenue. Martha listened sympathetically and took detailed notes, but her response left me feeling more isolated than before. She explained that Victoria had already approached her with concerns about my adjustment to new leadership structures. According to Victoria's account, I had been resistant to feedback, defensive about criticism, and unwilling to embrace new strategic directions. Martha assured me that these kinds of transition difficulties were normal and suggested that I might benefit from executive coaching to help navigate changing team dynamics. The conversation felt surreal. I was being presented with a version of myself that I didn't recognize, painted as a problem employee when my performance metrics and client feedback had consistently been excellent. Martha's well-meaning advice about embracing change and demonstrating flexibility felt like gaslighting, as if my legitimate concerns about being marginalized were character flaws that needed correction. My personal life began suffering under the stress. Jake noticed that I was bringing work anxiety home every night, obsessing over email conversations and analyzing every interaction for hidden meanings. I started working longer hours, arriving earlier and staying later, trying to prove my dedication and value. My sleep became restless, filled with anxiety dreams about losing my job or being publicly humiliated. I began stress eating, grabbing fast food for dinner instead of cooking healthy meals, and my credit card balance crept upward as I sought comfort in retail therapy. The relationship with Jake became strained as I struggled to process my emotions. He suggested that I consider looking for other opportunities, but the thought of abandoning the Blake Industries relationship I had built felt like admitting defeat. I had invested 3 years in developing expertise, building trust, and creating value. The idea of starting over somewhere else while watching Victoria claim credit for my work felt unbearable. My anxiety reached a breaking point during client calls. I would rehearse conversations beforehand, second-guessing every comment and wondering if Victoria was monitoring my interactions. When Harrison Blake called directly with questions about system upgrades, I found myself looking over my shoulder and speaking more cautiously than usual. The natural confidence I had always felt in my technical abilities began evaporating under the constant scrutiny and criticism. The second major shock came on a Friday afternoon, when I was working late to finish a quarterly report for Blake Industries. The office was nearly empty, except for the cleaning crew and a few developers who always stayed past normal hours. I had been struggling to access certain financial data for the report when I noticed Victoria's office light was still on. Her door was slightly ajar, and I could hear her speaking on the phone in a voice that carried more authority and excitement than I had heard before. Curiosity and concern drove me to move closer to her office, though I stayed in the hallway where I couldn't be seen. What I heard changed everything. Victoria was discussing a potential acquisition deal with someone she addressed as Harrison, and the numbers she mentioned made my breath catch. She was talking about selling Meridian Tech Solutions to Blake Industries for $5 billion, positioning herself as the architect of both the technology and the business relationship that made such a deal possible. My heart pounded as I heard her describe the AI security framework as her proprietary development and her vision for integrating our capabilities into Blake's existing infrastructure. She spoke confidently about timeline expectations, due diligence processes, and her role as the primary technical and business lead for the transaction. Most shocking of all, she was discussing plans for post-acquisition staffing that would eliminate redundant positions, particularly employees who might not fit the new corporate culture. I managed to slip back to my office without being detected, but my hands were shaking as I processed what I had overheard. Victoria wasn't just trying to marginalize my role or take credit for my work. She was planning to sell the entire company using my innovations as the foundation while positioning me as a liability to be eliminated in the process. The systematic exclusion, the rumors about my attitude problems, the restrictions on my access to information, it all made perfect sense as preparation for presenting me as an expendable employee during acquisition negotiations. The weekend that followed was a blur of anxiety and determination. I barely slept, spending hours researching corporate acquisition processes and trying to understand my legal rights and options. Jake tried to distract me with normal weekend activities, but I was consumed by the realization that my entire career was being orchestrated away from me by someone who had been in the company for less than 2 months. On Monday morning, I arrived at the office with a new sense of urgency. I needed to understand the scope of Victoria's plans and find ways to protect myself before she could complete whatever strategy she was implementing. But as I settled into my daily routine, checking emails and preparing for client calls, I had no idea that the situation was about to become even more complicated and painful than I could have imagined. The revelation about Victoria's acquisition plans transformed my approach from defensive to investigative. If she was planning to use my work as the foundation for a $5 billion deal while eliminating my position, I needed to understand exactly what I was facing and what resources I had available. The scared, confused employee was evolving into someone who refused to be a passive victim of corporate manipulation. I started by carefully reviewing every interaction I had witnessed between Victoria and other staff members. During lunch breaks, I began casual conversations with colleagues who had worked with her, listening for inconsistencies in her background story or examples of the expertise she claimed to possess. What I discovered was troubling but not entirely surprising. Victoria's MBA from Wharton became the first thread I pulled. During a casual conversation with Tom, one of our senior developers, he mentioned that Victoria had struggled to understand basic technical concepts during their orientation meeting. When he asked about her previous experience with cybersecurity or AI development, she had deflected by saying her business education focused on strategic thinking rather than technical implementation. But Tom found it odd that someone with an advanced degree from such a prestigious program wouldn't have any exposure to technology management or systems thinking. This conversation prompted me to do some research during my lunch hour. I started with LinkedIn, examining Victoria's professional profile and educational background. Her Wharton MBA was prominently displayed, but when I looked more closely at the timeline, something seemed off. She claimed to have completed the program while working full-time in consulting, but the dates didn't align properly with her employment history. More concerning, when I searched for her in Wharton's alumni directory, I couldn't find any record of her attendance. I decided to dig deeper by reaching out to a former Stanford classmate who had attended Wharton for her MBA. Sarah was now working at a consulting firm in New York, and we had maintained occasional contact through social media and alumni events. I called her during my lunch break, framing my inquiry as research for a potential business school application. When I mentioned Victoria's name and graduation year, Sarah was puzzled. She had been active in student organizations and knew most of her classmates, but she had never heard of Victoria. More damning, when I described Victoria's supposed concentration in strategy consulting, Sarah pointed out that Wharton's program structure during those years wouldn't have allowed for that specific combination of courses. Further research revealed that Victoria's MBA was from an online program offered by a school I had never heard of, not the prestigious Wharton program she claimed. The discovery was both satisfying and terrifying. She had built her entire professional credibility on a fraudulent educational background, yet she had successfully convinced my boss and the entire company of her qualifications. The embezzlement discovery came by accident while I was reviewing expense reports for our Blake Industries account. As the primary relationship manager, I had always tracked client entertainment expenses to ensure we stayed within budget and maintained appropriate professional boundaries. While looking for receipts from our recent client dinner, I noticed several charges that didn't match my records of our activities. Victoria had been using the corporate credit card for expenses that had nothing to do with client entertainment or business development. I found charges for expensive clothing shopping, luxury spa treatments, premium gym memberships, and high-end restaurant meals with people who weren't clients or colleagues. Most significantly, she had charged nearly $15,000 in apartment deposits and furniture purchases to the client entertainment budget, apparently using company funds to upgrade her living situation. I carefully documented each inappropriate expense, creating spreadsheets that tracked the dates, amounts, and vendors. The pattern was clear and consistent. Victoria was treating the corporate credit card as her personal spending account, disguising the charges under various client-related categories. The total amount approached $60,000 over just 6 weeks, a level of financial misconduct that would certainly result in criminal charges if discovered. But the most shocking discovery came when I remembered something from my original hiring process that I hadn't thought about in years. During my final negotiations with Robert, he had insisted on including some unusual language in my employment contract. At the time, I assumed it was standard legal protection, but I decided to review the documents more carefully. I found my contract files in a storage box in my apartment closet, buried under tax documents and old bank statements. As I read through the technical language and legal clauses, one section jumped out with new significance. Robert had included what he called a key person protection clause that designated me as essential personnel for any major transactions involving clients where I served as the primary relationship manager. The clause specifically stated that any merger, acquisition, or significant business transaction involving clients with whom I had direct relationships could not proceed without my explicit participation and approval. At the time, Robert had explained this as protection for both me and the company, ensuring that valuable client relationships wouldn't be disrupted by corporate changes. I had been flattered by the designation but hadn't considered its legal implications. As I read the clause more carefully, I realized its full significance. The Blake Industries acquisition that Victoria was planning couldn't legally proceed without my direct involvement and consent. She was structuring a deal based on my work and my client relationships, but the legal framework that governed those relationships required my participation. Victoria had been operating under the assumption that she could eliminate me while completing the transaction, but my employment contract made that impossible. I reached out to my former Stanford mentor, Professor Angela Morrison, who had transitioned from academia to corporate law after completing her PhD. Angela now worked for a prestigious firm in San Francisco that specialized in employment law and corporate transactions. I scheduled a call with her explaining my situation without revealing specific company names or details that might create conflicts of interest. Angela listened carefully as I described the key person clause and the acquisition scenario I was facing. Her response was immediate and reassuring. If the contract language was as clear as I described, any major transaction would be legally vulnerable without my participation. She advised me to document everything, maintain copies of all relevant contracts and communications, and consider whether I wanted to enforce the clause as leverage or use it defensively to protect my position. The conversation with Angela gave me a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time since Victoria's arrival, I had concrete evidence of my value and legal protection for my position. But Angela also warned me about the complexities of workplace politics and the importance of handling the situation strategically rather than confrontationally. That evening, I sat in my apartment with Jake, explaining the discoveries I had made and the options I was considering. He listened patiently as I outlined Victoria's educational fraud, the embezzlement evidence, and the key person clause that protected my position. His response surprised me with its clarity and confidence. Jake reminded me of stories I had shared about my childhood in rural Montana, where my father had taught me that integrity and hard work would always win against shortcuts and deception. He pointed out that Victoria's entire strategy was built on lies and theft, while my position was grounded in legitimate achievements and legal protections. He encouraged me to fight back rather than accept victimization, but to do so thoughtfully and strategically. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt a shift in my mindset from defensive survival to proactive strategy. Victoria had underestimated my capabilities and resources, building her plans on assumptions that weren't accurate. The scared employee who had been questioning her own value was transforming into someone ready to expose the truth and protect what she had legitimately earned. But even as I felt more confident about my position, I had no idea how complex the situation was about to become, or how many other people were operating with their own hidden agendas and incomplete information. Armed with evidence of Victoria's fraud and a clearer understanding of my legal protections, I began developing a comprehensive strategy to protect myself and expose her misconduct. But I knew I needed to be careful and methodical. Rushing into confrontation without proper preparation could backfire and give Victoria the opportunity to spin the situation in her favor. My first step was documenting everything more systematically. I created encrypted files on my personal laptop, carefully organizing evidence of Victoria's educational fraud, embezzlement, and attempts to claim credit for my work. I started recording meetings and phone calls using a voice recording app on my phone, which was legal in Texas under one-party consent laws. Every interaction with Victoria became an opportunity to gather evidence of her incompetence and misconduct. I also began rebuilding and strengthening my direct relationship with Blake Industries, carefully positioning myself as the continuity person for ongoing projects. During technical support calls, I made sure to demonstrate my deep understanding of their systems and my personal investment in their success. I started sending regular updates directly to their IT team, providing proactive insights about emerging cybersecurity threats and suggestions for system improvements. The strategy was working. Harrison Blake's technical staff began reaching out to me directly when issues arose, bypassing Victoria entirely. They appreciated my responsiveness and expertise, and I could sense their frustration when Victoria tried to insert herself into technical discussions she clearly didn't understand. I documented these interactions carefully, building a record of my continued value and their preference for working with me directly. My personal life began stabilizing as I focused on taking action rather than feeling victimized. Jake noticed the change in my energy and confidence, commenting that I seemed more like the person he had first met, determined, capable, and optimistic about my future. We started exercising together in the mornings, which helped me manage stress and maintain mental clarity. I was sleeping better, eating more healthily, and feeling genuinely excited about my work again. I also started mentoring junior employees who were experiencing similar challenges with Victoria's management style. Sarah, one of the recent graduates who had been reassigned away from my projects, confided that Victoria was taking credit for her research work and excluding her from meetings where her findings were presented. I advised Sarah to document her contributions carefully and offered to serve as a reference if she decided to pursue other opportunities. These mentoring conversations revealed that Victoria's misconduct extended beyond her treatment of me. She was systematically undermining multiple employees, creating a pattern of behavior that would be difficult for the company to ignore once properly documented. I encouraged each person to keep detailed records while assuring them that they weren't alone in their experiences. The fourth major twist came during what I thought was routine research into Victoria's background. I had been trying to understand more about her previous work experience when I discovered something that completely changed my understanding of the situation. While reviewing public corporate filings for companies where Victoria claimed to have worked, I found records of meetings between Robert Hartman and executives from 3 major technology companies. The documents showed that Robert had been in discussions about potential acquisitions or mergers for several months before Victoria joined the company. He wasn't simply responding to Blake Industries' interest, he was actively shopping Meridian Tech solutions to multiple buyers, using the Blake relationship as leverage to drive up competing offers. Victoria's acquisition project wasn't her strategic initiative. It was part of a larger plan that Robert had been developing independently. This discovery forced me to reconsider everything I thought I understood about the company's direction and Robert's motivations. He wasn't the benevolent mentor I had imagined, focused on building long-term value and supporting employee growth. He was preparing for retirement by maximizing the company's sale price, regardless of the impact on employees who had contributed to its success. The realization was both devastating and enlightening. Robert had hired Victoria not because he believed in her capabilities, but because he needed someone to manage the appearance of business development leadership while he negotiated behind the scenes. Victoria was being used just as much as I was, though her willingness to engage in fraud and embezzlement suggested she was a more willing participant in the deception. I started researching the other potential buyers, trying to understand their interest in our company and their likely approach to post-acquisition staffing. What I found was sobering. Most technology acquisitions resulted in significant layoffs, particularly in overlapping business development and administrative functions. Even if I successfully protected my position in the Blake Industries deal, Robert's broader strategy might result in my elimination anyway. But this research also revealed opportunities. Each potential buyer had different strengths and strategic priorities, which meant the value they placed on specific employees and capabilities would vary significantly. If I could position myself effectively with multiple potential acquirers, I might be able to create competition for my services rather than simply hoping for protection from a single buyer. The breakthrough moment came when I decided to reach out directly to Harrison Blake, bypassing Victoria completely. I crafted a careful email requesting a private conversation about technical upgrades and security enhancements, framing it as proactive client service rather than workplace politics. Harrison responded within hours, suggesting a phone call for the following morning. The conversation revealed that Harrison had been conducting his own investigation into our company and had discovered several concerning inconsistencies. He had attempted to verify Victoria's background and expertise, but had been unable to find evidence supporting her claims. He was particularly troubled by her inability to answer technical questions during their meetings and her tendency to deflect detailed discussions by citing confidentiality concerns. More significantly, Harrison revealed that he had been in direct communication with Robert about the acquisition terms and timeline. He was aware of the competing offers and the pressure Robert was feeling to maximize the sale price. But Harrison also expressed concerns about maintaining the quality and continuity of service that had made our partnership so successful. When I mentioned the key person clause in my contract, Harrison's response was immediate and decisive. He confirmed that Blake Industries had specifically requested that clause during our original contract negotiations because they valued my technical expertise and wanted protection against staff changes that might disrupt their service. He had assumed that any acquisition discussion would naturally include provisions protecting my position and involvement. The phone call concluded with Harrison making a statement that completely shifted the balance of power in my favor. He told me directly that Blake Industries would only proceed with an acquisition if I was designated as the technical lead for their account, with guaranteed equity participation and protection from retaliation. If those conditions weren't met, Blake Industries would withdraw from discussions and explore alternative cybersecurity partnerships. I ended the call feeling simultaneously empowered and nervous. Harrison's support gave me tremendous leverage, but it also meant that Victoria's entire strategy was built on assumptions that weren't accurate. She was planning to eliminate me from a deal that couldn't proceed without my participation, setting up a confrontation that would force everyone involved to choose between her vision and the legal and business reality of the situation. As I prepared for what I knew would be the final phase of this corporate drama, I reflected on how much I had learned about business politics and my own capabilities. The naive employee who had trusted that hard work and integrity would automatically be recognized and rewarded had evolved into someone who understood the importance of strategic thinking, documentation, and legal protection. But even with all my preparation and evidence, I had no idea how explosive the final confrontation would be or how many secrets would be revealed when everyone's hidden agendas finally collided in one dramatic moment. The discovery of Robert's broader acquisition strategy forced me to reconsider my entire approach to the situation. I could no longer view this as a simple conflict between Victoria and myself, or even as a case of workplace misconduct that needed to be reported to appropriate authorities. This was a complex corporate transaction involving multiple parties with competing interests, and I needed to understand everyone's motivations before deciding how to proceed. I requested a private meeting with Robert, framing it as a career development conversation rather than a confrontation about Victoria's behavior or the acquisition rumors. Robert agreed immediately, which surprised me, given how busy he had seemed recently with mysterious meetings and phone calls. We scheduled the discussion for late afternoon in his office when most of the staff had left for the day. Robert's office reflected his personality, warm but professional, with family photos mixed among industry awards and framed articles about Meridian Tech's innovations. He offered coffee and settled into his chair with the relaxed manner of someone who enjoyed mentoring conversations. But as I began explaining what I had discovered, his demeanor shifted from paternal warmth to surprised respect. I outlined Victoria's educational fraud systematically, showing him the evidence I had gathered about her false Wharton MBA and the online diploma mill she had actually attended. I presented the embezzlement documentation, including spreadsheets tracking her inappropriate use of corporate credit cards for personal expenses. Most importantly, I explained how she had been claiming credit for my technical innovations and client relationship work. Robert listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification or requesting to see specific pieces of evidence. His expression grew more serious as the scope of Victoria's misconduct became clear. When I finished presenting my findings, he sat quietly for several minutes, clearly processing the implications of what he had learned. His response surprised me with its honesty and vulnerability. Robert admitted that hiring Victoria had been a mistake driven by parental obligation rather than business judgment. He explained that Victoria had been struggling to find stable employment after several failed attempts at consulting and startup ventures. When she approached him about joining Meridian Tech, he had been reluctant but felt pressure from his wife to give their daughter an opportunity to prove herself in the family business. But Robert's confession went much deeper than simply acknowledging his daughter's shortcomings. He revealed that he had been planning his retirement strategy for over 2 years, including preliminary discussions with multiple potential acquirers. The Blake Industries opportunity was attractive, but he had been simultaneously negotiating with 3 other technology companies to maximize the sale price and ensure the best outcome for shareholders and employees. The complexity of his situation became clear as he explained his dilemma. Victoria's incompetence was jeopardizing the Blake Industries acquisition, but he felt trapped between his responsibility as a father and his obligation to the company. He had been hoping to find ways to manage Victoria's mistakes while protecting the business relationships that made Meridian Tech valuable to potential buyers. Robert's next revelation caught me completely off guard. He offered me a promotion to Senior Vice President of Business Development with significant equity participation and a guaranteed role in any acquisition scenario. The position would make me Victoria's equal in the corporate hierarchy and give me direct authority over client relationships and business development strategy. In exchange, he asked me to help navigate the acquisition process diplomatically, finding ways to minimize Victoria's involvement without creating family conflict that might disrupt the business. The offer was tempting, but it also felt like asking me to become complicit in covering up Victoria's fraud and misconduct. Robert was essentially asking me to help him protect his daughter from the consequences of her actions while ensuring the company's sale proceeded smoothly. I appreciated his honesty about the situation, but I wasn't comfortable with the ethical compromises his proposal required. Our conversation was interrupted by Robert's assistant announcing that Harrison Blake was on the phone requesting an urgent conversation. Robert apologized for the interruption, but asked me to stay while he took the call, explaining that Blake Industries matters always took priority. What I heard during that phone call became the fifth major bombshell in this increasingly complex situation. Harrison Blake's voice was calm but firm as he explained to Robert that he had been conducting due diligence on Meridian Tech's leadership team and had discovered concerning information about Victoria's background and qualifications. He had independently verified that her educational credentials were fraudulent and had found evidence of questionable business practices in her previous employment. More significantly, he had learned about her attempts to exclude me from the acquisition discussions, despite the key person clause that required my participation. But Harrison's most shocking revelation was that he had been aware of Robert's negotiations with other potential buyers from the beginning. Blake Industries had been conducting their own investigation into Meridian Tech's value and had identified the competing offers as part of their strategic assessment. Rather than being concerned about the competition, Harrison was using the information to structure a more attractive deal that would eliminate the uncertainty of a bidding war. Harrison's ultimatum was clear and non-negotiable. Blake Industries would proceed with the acquisition only if I was designated as the primary technical and business relationship manager for their account, with guaranteed equity participation and protection from retaliation. If Victoria remained in any position that could interfere with my responsibilities, or the client relationship, Blake Industries would withdraw their offer and pursue alternative cybersecurity partnerships. The conversation concluded with Harrison requesting a formal meeting within 48 hours to finalize the acquisition terms or officially end the discussions. Robert agreed to the timeline, but his face showed the stress of someone trapped between competing pressures with no clear path forward. After Harrison ended the call, Robert turned to me with an expression that mixed frustration, admiration, and resignation. He acknowledged that my strategic thinking and relationship management had created a situation where the company's most valuable acquisition opportunity depended on my continued involvement. He also admitted that Victoria's misconduct had become a liability that could no longer be ignored or managed diplomatically. But Robert's final revelation was the most surprising of all. He confessed that he had always known Victoria wasn't qualified for her position and had been secretly hoping that I would either find ways to work around her incompetence or present him with evidence that would justify her removal. He had never intended for her to actually lead the Blake Industries relationship or play a significant role in the acquisition negotiations. She had been placed in a prominent position to satisfy family expectations while he searched for legal and ethical ways to minimize her actual responsibilities. The conversation ended with Robert asking me to consider taking over complete responsibility for the Blake Industries acquisition with his full support and protection against any interference from Victoria. He promised that her employment would be terminated based on the fraud and embezzlement evidence, but he requested time to handle the family implications privately before making any public announcements. I left Robert's office that evening feeling simultaneously vindicated and overwhelmed. My strategic preparation had created the leverage I needed to protect my position and advance my career, but the personal and family dynamics involved made the situation more complicated than a simple workplace conflict. I also realized that Victoria still didn't understand how dramatically her position had changed, and that the final confrontation would likely be explosive when she discovered that her entire strategy was built on false assumptions. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the strange journey from naive employee to corporate strategist, and I wondered whether I was fully prepared for the final phase of this drama that would determine not just my career future, but the fate of the entire company. The final signing meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning in Meridian Tech's main conference room, which had been transformed into something resembling a corporate war room. Legal documents covered the polished oak table, and Victoria had arranged for catering from Austin's most expensive restaurant to impress the Blake Industries delegation. She had clearly envisioned this as her moment of triumph, the culmination of what she believed was her strategic masterstroke. I arrived early, ostensibly to review technical specifications one final time, but really to observe the setup and prepare mentally for what I knew would be a career-defining confrontation. Victoria was already there wearing a navy blue power suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary directing the administrative staff, with the confidence of someone who believed she controlled the entire situation. The attendees began gathering at 9 o'clock sharp. Harrison Blake arrived with his chief technology officer and chief legal counsel professional and composed as always. The Meridian Tech Board of Directors filed in looking appropriately serious for a transaction of this magnitude. Robert appeared calm, but I could see tension in his posture, the stress of a man caught between family loyalty and business necessity. Victoria positioned herself at the head of the table with Robert to her right, and me several seats away in what was clearly intended to be a supporting role. She had prepared a presentation folder for each attendee complete with deal summaries, timeline projections, and organizational charts showing the post-acquisition leadership structure. My name appeared nowhere in the strategic leadership positions. The meeting began with Victoria's opening remarks, which were polished and confident. She thanked everyone for their commitment to what she called a transformative partnership and outlined her vision for integrating Meridian Tech's innovations into Blake Industries' infrastructure. She spoke about synergies, market opportunities, and the strategic advantages that would result from combining their respective expertise. Harrison Blake listened politely, but I noticed his expressions becoming more skeptical as Victoria continued speaking. When she began discussing technical implementation details using terminology she clearly didn't understand, his chief technology officer exchanged concerned glances with his legal counsel. Victoria's presentation was impressive on the surface, but anyone with actual technical knowledge could see that she was reciting memorized phrases without comprehending their meaning. The formal document review proceeded smoothly until they reached the section addressing key personnel and transition planning. Victoria presented her organizational chart, showing herself as Chief Technology Integration Officer, responsible for managing all aspects of the Blake Industries relationship post-acquisition. She explained that this structure would provide continuity and strategic focus, ensuring seamless integration of technical and business operations. Harrison Blake examined the organizational chart carefully, then looked directly at me before addressing Victoria. He asked where my role was defined in the transition planning given my history with Blake Industries and my technical expertise with their systems. Victoria smiled confidently and explained that I would be remaining in my current support role, providing technical assistance as needed, while she focused on strategic leadership and relationship management. The room fell silent as Harrison Blake's expression shifted from polite interest to obvious displeasure. He set down the organizational chart and turned to Robert, asking if this personnel structure accurately reflected Meridian Tech's commitments for the acquisition. Robert looked uncomfortable, glancing between Victoria and me, before responding that personnel decisions were still being finalized based on client preferences and business requirements. Victoria's confidence was clearly shaken by Harrison's questions, but she attempted to regain control by suggesting they move forward with the contract signing and address staffing details during the implementation phase. She gestured toward the signature pages, explaining that all terms had been negotiated and approved by both companies' legal teams. Harrison Blake remained seated, making no move toward the documents. Instead, he asked Victoria directly about her background and qualifications for managing the Blake Industries relationship. He inquired about her previous experience with cybersecurity implementations, her technical education, and her specific knowledge of their systems and requirements. Victoria's responses became increasingly vague and defensive. She cited her MBA and consulting experience, spoke about strategic thinking and relationship management, but avoided any specific technical questions. When Harrison asked about particular security protocols they had implemented, she deflected by saying she preferred to focus on high-level strategic vision rather than operational details. The tension in the room was becoming palpable. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Robert's face showed the strain of watching his carefully planned transaction beginning to unravel. Victoria's composure was cracking as she realized that her preparation hadn't anticipated this level of scrutiny from Harrison Blake. The climactic moment arrived when Victoria, apparently deciding that assertiveness was her best strategy, made the announcement that would destroy her position irrevocably. She stood up, straightened her shoulders, and declared that the acquisition would proceed more smoothly without employees who might resist the changes necessary for successful integration. Then, pointing directly at me, she announced, "You're fired, Sandy. Your position has become redundant and your attitude inappropriate for our new corporate culture." The room erupted into shocked silence. Harrison Blake stared at Victoria in obvious disbelief, while Robert's face went white with horror. The board members looked confused and alarmed, clearly unprepared for this dramatic personnel announcement during a signing meeting. I remained seated, maintaining my composure despite my racing heartbeat, knowing that Victoria had just made the mistake I had been preparing for. Harrison Blake's response was immediate and devastating. "Who?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. When Victoria smugly replied, "Her," gesturing toward me, Harrison began to laugh. Not a polite chuckle, but genuine amusement at what he clearly viewed as an absurd misunderstanding. He reached across the table, slid the term sheet directly to Robert, and pointed to a specific clause highlighted in yellow. "The key person clause," he said, clearly ensuring everyone in the room could hear him. "This acquisition cannot legally proceed without Sandy's direct participation and approval. She's not an employee we're acquiring. She's the primary reason we're interested in this company." Victoria's face drained of color as Harrison continued speaking. He explained that Blake Industries had specifically requested the key person protection clause during their original contract negotiations because they valued my technical expertise and wanted assurance that our partnership would continue regardless of corporate changes. The clause made me essential personnel for any major transaction involving Blake Industries, with legal veto power over acquisition terms. But Harrison wasn't finished dismantling Victoria's position. He revealed that Blake Industries had conducted thorough due diligence on Meridian Tech's leadership team and had discovered her educational fraud, embezzlement, and attempts to claim credit for work she hadn't performed. He had copies of her fraudulent resume, documentation of her inappropriate corporate credit card charges, and recorded conversations where she demonstrated clear incompetence regarding the technical systems she claimed to have developed. The revelation continued as Harrison explained that Blake Industries would only proceed with the acquisition under specific conditions. I would be designated as Chief Technology Officer for their account, with significant equity participation and complete authority over the technical relationship. If these conditions weren't met, or if there was any retaliation against me for Victoria's misconduct, Blake Industries would withdraw their offer and pursue alternative cybersecurity partnerships. Victoria's final desperate attempt to salvage her position involved threats of legal action. She declared that she would sue both companies for gender discrimination and wrongful termination, claiming that her treatment was based on bias against young women in leadership positions. Her voice rose to near hysteria as she insisted that her qualifications and contributions were being unfairly dismissed. Harrison Blake's response was swift and final. He calmly explained that Victoria's recorded statements admitting to fraud and embezzlement combined with documented evidence of her misconduct made any legal threats meaningless. He had consulted with employment attorneys and been assured that terminating an employee for criminal behavior was not only legally defensible, but required to protect the company's fiduciary responsibilities. Robert finally spoke, his voice heavy with resignation and disappointment. He formally accepted Harrison Blake's conditions, terminated Victoria's employment effective immediately, and offered me the position of Vice President of Technology Integration with the equity participation and protection guarantees Blake Industries had requested. The acquisition would proceed as planned, with Victoria's misconduct treated as a separate legal matter to be handled by appropriate authorities. Victoria left the conference room in tears, escorted by security and accompanied by HR representatives who would manage her immediate departure and coordinate with legal counsel regarding the embezzlement charges. The remaining attendees spent the next 2 hours finalizing contract details and implementation timelines, with me taking the leadership role I should have held from the beginning. As I signed the documents that secured both the acquisition and my future with the combined company, I reflected on the strange journey from victim to victor and the importance of preparation, patience, and legal protection in navigating corporate politics. Victoria's downfall had been entirely self-inflicted, the result of building her strategy on lies and underestimating the people she was trying to manipulate. 6 months later, I sat in my new corner office on the 40th floor of Blake Industries Tower, looking out over the Austin skyline as the sun set behind the hills west of the city. The office was 3 times larger than my previous workspace, with floor-to-ceiling windows, a private conference area, and space for the technical equipment I needed to manage our expanding cybersecurity operations. But more than the physical trappings, what filled me with satisfaction was the knowledge that I had earned this position through integrity, competence, and strategic thinking rather than manipulation or deception. The acquisition of Meridian Tech Solutions had closed successfully 2 months earlier, creating Blake Cybersecurity Solutions, one of the largest AI security companies in the Southwest. My equity stake in the combined company had made me financially secure for life, but more importantly, I had gained the respect and trust of colleagues who valued innovation and ethical leadership. The fear and anxiety that had consumed me during Victoria's reign of terror felt like distant memories from someone else's life. Harrison Blake had kept every promise he made during our negotiations. As Chief Technology Officer and Vice President of Client Relations, I had complete authority over technical strategy and implementation for all cybersecurity operations. My team had grown from 8 employees to 35, including several of my former Stanford classmates, who I had recruited to help manage our expanding client base. We were developing cutting-edge AI security solutions that were months ahead of our competitors, and our client satisfaction scores were the highest in the industry. My personal life had flourished alongside my professional success. Jake and I had bought a beautiful house in the hills overlooking Lake Austin, with a home office where I could work remotely, and a garden where we spent weekend mornings drinking coffee and planning our future together. The stress-related health problems that had plagued me during the corporate conflict had disappeared completely. I was sleeping well, exercising regularly, and enjoying the kind of work-life balance that had seemed impossible during the darkest days of Victoria's sabotage campaign. The resolution of Victoria's legal troubles had been swift and decisive. The embezzlement evidence I had gathered, combined with additional financial irregularities discovered during the acquisition due diligence process, resulted in criminal charges for fraud and theft. Victoria ultimately pleaded guilty to avoid a lengthy trial and received 2 years of probation community service and full restitution to Meridian Tech. She was also required to pay substantial fines and was banned from holding corporate officer positions for 10 years. Robert Hartman had completed his planned retirement, but maintained a positive relationship with me and the new company leadership. During our final conversation before he stepped down, he acknowledged his mistakes in enabling Victoria's misconduct and expressed genuine pride in my professional growth and ethical leadership. He used his remaining months at the company to establish clear governance policies, preventing future nepotistic appointments, and ensuring that all personnel decisions were based solely on qualifications and performance. The mentorship programs I had implemented for junior employees had become a model for other departments throughout Blake Industries. Sarah, the recent graduate who Victoria had tried to marginalize, was now leading our client research division and pursuing an advanced degree in cybersecurity with company sponsorship. Several other employees who had experienced similar treatment had been promoted to positions that matched their talents and contributions, creating a culture focused on merit rather than politics. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the resolution was the expansion of our client relationships beyond Blake Industries. Word of our innovative security solutions and ethical business practices had spread throughout the technology industry, resulting in contracts with major corporations across multiple sectors. We were no longer dependent on a single client relationship, having built a diverse portfolio that provided stability and growth opportunities for our entire team. The lessons I learned during this experience had transformed my understanding of both business and personal resilience. I discovered that workplace bullying and corruption ultimately defeat themselves when victims refuse to remain silent and develop strategic approaches to gathering evidence and building support. Victoria's downfall wasn't caused by my actions against her. It was the inevitable result of building a career on lies, theft, and manipulation. I learned the critical importance of documentation, legal protection, and professional relationships in navigating corporate politics. The key person clause that saved my position had been in my contract for years, but I only recognized its value when I needed leverage against someone trying to destroy my career. Similarly, my relationship with Harrison Blake, built on competence and integrity rather than politics, provided the external support necessary to overcome internal corporate dysfunction. Most importantly, I realized that maintaining ethical standards during conflict isn't just morally correct, it's strategically advantageous. While Victoria exhausted her energy on deception and manipulation, I focused on continuing to deliver excellent work and build genuine relationships. When the final confrontation arrived, my position was supported by documented achievements and legal protections while hers crumbled under scrutiny. The experience taught me that true professional success comes from building authentic value rather than playing political games. Clients like Harrison Blake can distinguish between genuine expertise and superficial presentation, and they make decisions based on results rather than rhetoric. Colleagues respect leaders who support their growth rather than undermining their confidence in organizations ultimately prosper when they reward competence rather than connections. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that shocking boardroom confrontation 6 months earlier. The scared, isolated employee who had questioned her own worth and capabilities had evolved into a confident leader running a major division of a Fortune 500 company. The transformation hadn't happened through luck or miracles, but through strategic thinking, ethical behavior, and the courage to fight for what I had legitimately earned. Standing at my office windows watching the lights come on across Austin as the city settled into evening, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. The pain and uncertainty of being targeted by someone like Victoria had been genuinely difficult, but it had also revealed strengths and capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. Sometimes the best revenge truly is simply being excellent at what you do while refusing to accept anything less than you deserve. Before you go, I want to ask you something that's been on my mind as I've shared this story. Have you ever faced a situation where someone tried to take credit for your work or undermine your position? How did you handle it, and what would you do differently if it happened again? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Sometimes sharing our stories helps others who might be facing similar challenges right now. If this story resonated with you or taught you something valuable about standing up for yourself in the workplace, please hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear this message. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about overcoming workplace injustice and finding the courage to fight for what you've earned. Thank you so much for listening to my journey from victim to victor. I hope it inspires you to recognize your own value, document your achievements, and never let anyone convince you to accept less than you deserve. Until next time, keep building authentic success through integrity, competence, and the courage to stand up for yourself when it matters most.